Hello everyone, welcome to my patch 15.2 tier list. We're going to go over the changes obviously and how they affect the champs in the meta, and at the end I'm also going to talk about some of the ways to counterpick and blind pick on this patch, because I think there's a lot of champions that are in the meta but they're only used as specific counters to other things, and of course there's some champs that are just blind picked because they're overpowered. So let's start off by talking about the big news, which is Mel. So a lot of you might have seen my thoughts on Mel already. Mel is really OP. Now, she is getting a hotfix nerf. This, I don't believe has been released yet, but I think it's coming out today. And basically, this is just like a little nerf to damage across the board, which is nice, to be honest. It is a nice little nerf, but I don't think it really fixes what is fundamentally OP about her, which I think is Q range and W damage immunity. I suspect that until W damage immunity is fixed, that she's still going to be just like insane, at least as a counter pick. Potentially she can be countered by some champs. Now if I just bring up the tier list here, I do have Mel in my S tier. She might be the best mid in the game at the moment, but after post hotfix we'll have to see. I do think that champions with low spammable cooldowns, like things like Ori or Viktor, probably do destroy her in lane. But the thing is that, Mel against any champ that sort of needs to all in or combo or has like one specific cooldown that can be reflected, that's really important. She's insane against all of these, and she's just an OP champ in general. She has like pretty good win rate already. I don't really like using win rate as a stat in general. I don't think it's that valuable, but one, good tell, I guess, for if a new champ is OP on release is that when it comes out, it has a very high win rate, because typically people are just not very good at new champs. But Mel is simultaneously not insanely hard, but still has like a lot of depth to her, and I definitely don't think that the skill cap has been reached or is even close to being reached. There's still going to be a lot of room for improvement, and so her win rate already being so high this early on in the patch is definitely a little worrying. So our next one on this list is Cassio. So they nerfed Cassio's free boot upgrade a little bit, which is just to kind of bring it in line with the other boots not being that great. I think all the other boots are kind of at the point where they're sort of like elixirs, like you can buy them if you have nothing else to buy and there's a fight coming up, but overall they're not that strong. Like their main strength comes from being able to spend gold when you wouldn't have been able to spend gold otherwise, but the boots themselves are not insanely overpowered. So they nerfed this a little bit for Cassio. Now I got a lot of complaints in the last tier list about how low I'd put Cassio. I had her somewhere in the low B tier. I think I definitely underestimated Cassio a little bit as a counter pick, but I still don't see her leaving the B tier, and the reason for that is that she is still an absolutely atrocious blind, and if people are blinding correctly, you're still going to be you're going to have a lot of difficulty picking Cassio. That being said, if you are in a lower elo and people are not blinding as well, and you're, playing against champions that are considered off meta or not good blinds, there probably is some value to Cassio. Personally, I did use counterpick Cassio a lot this patch. I went 5-0 on her, but I never played it into a bad matchup. So I played it bot lane, into kind of these melee short range lanes. Very good for Silas, Yasuo, Akshan, basically the things that like you normally pick it into. But for me, I would still kind of recommend not picking Cassio all the time. Like I think Cassio as a one trick is definitely not super strong at the moment. So yeah, for me, it's kind of unchanged, like the buff and the nerf. She's still just like a good counter pick into a few champions. I still think there are stronger counter picks, potentially, like into Silas. You might want to go something like Zoe instead. But if you can get a good Cassio game, maybe they have more tanks or something, then I do think it's good. So Irelia got some nerfs as well. Previous patch, I put her at the top of B tier, and I didn't actually move her. So potentially could move Irelia around, because I think the way these damage numbers work is it's like, Irelia is a champ that really needs to snowball, and if like you do ever miss a kill because of these, like it is going to be a big problem. The thing is though, like most of the time, like since you're a sustained DPS champ, it's not like you're going to run out of damage. It's more about like, can you, catch them out, or do you have the space to run them down to begin with? So I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. Could be wrong on this though. Like I don't see a whole lot of Irelia in my games. It is exclusively a counter pick, and I don't play a whole lot of it myself. Irelia has been getting more play this split than previously. Like Showmaker, for example, has been playing it in Korean solo queue as a counter pick to certain things. So I definitely think it's like a champ that probably was like maybe a little OP, but I still think the things that make her a really good counterpick mid are still present, and I don't really see her, suddenly not being a good counterpick because of this. So like most likely I think this is fine. There's also a change to Smolder here, which is basically just to make it so that I is a good item on here. I'm kind of mixed feelings on Smolder, so I moved him up to A tier, but the reason I moved him up to A tier is because he's specifically a really good counter to Galio, and Galio is like very strong in the meta. Smolder is very good into most melees in general, especially like assassins or things that need to burst where you can build health into them. Anything that's melee is much easier to stack against as well. I don't really think you should be blinding Smolder this split. I think the matchups are overall a bit too hard. Compared to last split, the big one being that Viktor is now in meta, so you kind of have to use an extra ban on Viktor, and that leaves open other things that you would rather not deal with. So For me, he is higher because he's so good into Galio, but I don't think the IE change is actually massive. So the thing is, like, I've experimented with a few builds. I've experimented with IE second. I'm not 100% sold on IE second. It's a very difficult item to buy second because the build path kind of sucks and it's very expensive. Also, I think if you're playing mid Smolder, it's a lot more difficult to side lane without having extra HP, especially if you are playing into one of these assassin matchups. So I'm honestly not sure what's best. Like, it might be better to go, like, for example, Essence Reaver, Shojin, IE. It could be maybe if you're in a greedy matchup, right, something that can't punish you, you do just go Essence Reaver, IE. Or perhaps you just play the normal build, like Essence Reaver, Shojin, and then, like, Rapid Fire LDR or whatever. And then after that, you kind of cap out with IE. So I'm still not 100% sure on this. Smolder bot has now been going crit a lot more, so most likely it is better to play the crit build overall. It's just where is the best spot to actually build your IE. I'm not 100% sure yet. But I do just think the main thing is, like, if you do want to be playing Smolder now, make sure you're using him as a counter pick. I've been asked a lot about these Viktor nerfs. So basically what they did is they nerfed his late game damage. So you can see that there is a little bit less AP scaling on this. And then also some less AP scaling on the ulti. So that is definitely, like, you know, that's a little bit of damage missing. It does add up. The thing is, though, like, Viktor already scaled so insanely well. And honestly, what I think makes Viktor OP is his strength of lane. Like, he's extremely, extremely good against any mage, especially ones that don't have gang set up, because one of the best ways, like, realistically, the way to counter Viktor is with your jungle and support. It's, like, less about the mid pick. In mid, I think the best thing you can do is, like, pick some form of strong lane plus gang setup. So something like Syndra is good, or you can kind of, like, risk like losing lane, just have really good gang setup. So just something like Aurora, but you are really reliant on getting help. I did move him to the top of A. You could maybe argue that he's still S, but I think it's like, at least I noticed in high elo, especially on places like Korea where the support and jungles are really active, the Viktor does get ganked a lot, and that means that it's much harder for him to actually pressure the lane. I suspect outside of high elos where you're not getting ganked as much, Viktor might still be S, because I think he keeps those, you know, things that make him really strong. At the same time, you could argue that in lower elos, people aren't as good at pressuring lane. And so, like, now they're getting less scaling than they were before, which is the main thing I think low elo players were getting out of Viktor. So we'll probably keep him at the top of A, but I still think he's very strong. If you do want to move Viktor to kind of like counterpick tier at the moment, I think you definitely could. You know, there are a lot of matchups up here that, at least in the 1v1, are very unplayable against Viktor if they get blinded. So, you know, for example, Aurora without the ganking champs around her, I think it should be good into Mel. It's really, really good into, like, Ahri and Ori, especially if they don't receive ganks. Talia, Viktor, or sorry, Jayce. There's a lot of really good matchups, basically. So I think while you can blind him, be a little bit careful to support jungle. And he's still extremely strong as a counter pick if you do get away with him. He's absolutely great. And I think the nerfs are still kind of fake news. I think they need to take damage out of his more or less point and click abilities. Like, E is not really a skill shot, to be honest, and Q obviously is point and click. Maybe taking a little bit of health away from the shield at level 1 could make a big difference. So that's the actual champion changes out of the way, but I also want to talk about a few champions in the meta. So the first one that I've moved up a lot is Jayce. So tank Jayce is actually quite good even in mid, and if you go to, like, you know, some of the higher elo players OPGGs, you will see, like, Jayce being practiced. So obviously it's popping up in scrims, and it has been played in, like, LCK and stuff a few times. So I think the thing with Jayce is that, well, the reason that Jayce kind of wasn't that good before is because into mage matchups it's really, really difficult unless you get, you know, some sort of assistance and can really get snowballing. That being said, the AD mid champion pool is a bit lacking at the moment, so we kind of have to find something to play. I'll talk about that in a second, but the tank Jayce is good against a few things. It's really, really good against AD champs because the armor that you can get is really, really nice. On top of that, it's pretty good against champions that don't have good DPS and they just have burst, because against burst champions, you know, something like a Kiana, if they can't kill you, you can just absolutely farm them, which is really, really nice. I don't think it should be played every game, and you will see when you look at them that they do mix it up. Actually, Chovy's been playing tank every game, but I do think you should mix it up. I think there are games where, like, if you're confident you can snowball, your matchup's a bit easier. Maybe you can get, like, Dirk or something consistently early in the matchup. I think you can definitely play for that. But having tank Jayce as an option in your matchup makes him a lot more pickable, which is super, super nice, and that's why I put him higher up on the list. Another champ that has kind of joined the meta lately is Vlad. So Vlad is being played specifically as a counter to Aurora. Aurora is very, very strong, so having counter picks to her is quite important. The main issue, I guess, with counterpicking Aurora is that any melee champion is very easily punished, or any champ that's, like, not particularly strong in lane, Aurora can kind of get a free lane and just get to the skirmishing, which is obviously super overpowered. So you want something that can kind of punish the laning phase. But, you know, again, most of those champions that do punish, those long range mages, they're very immobile, and Aurora's gank step is so good that you can just gank them over and over. So that's where Vlad comes in. Like, Vlad is able to, with TP and D shield, sustain through Aurora's poke. Also is virtually ungankable and is really, really good against Aurora on the side. Plus, you can pull under her ulti. So Vlad is, yeah, kind of used just purely as a counter to Aurora. It's actually not the most straightforward matchup. I do think that, like, whenever I see the Vlad versus Aurora matchup, you often do see the Vlad losing prio and stuff early game. So it's more of like a scaling counter pick. And I think, again, it's kind of just because, like, what do you realistically pick into Aurora? You know, you can pick things like Viktor or Ori that, like, really destroy a 1v1. But then if they have, like, a good combo and Aurora, Jarvan, Rel, you know, something like this, you are just going to get ganked over and over. If you play something that's immune to gank, something like Lissandra, you're just not going to be able to punish enough, and the champ is just overall better. So unless you can pick one of these S tier champions yourselves just to match, you kind of have to look for some like more niche counter pick, because a lot of the time these other S tier champs will be banned. So yeah, that's why Vlad's being played. I'm still not 100% sold that like Vlad is actually worth it, you know what I mean? Like, ultimately, I don't think Vlad is like insanely strong. It's just that Aurora has very few answers, and this happens to be one of the better ones. Another one I want to mention is Azir, and I actually think Azir could go even higher, but the reason I've put him lower is because he is quite difficult to play, and I think that for most players, it honestly just like isn't really worth it to play Azir. But Azir is actually quite strong, so he's been played a fair amount in competitive. He's getting played in solo queue. Partially, this is due to a couple different builds. So there's a new lethal tempo build that you can play where you don't build any attack speed whatsoever. You just go lethal tempo, and then you go for Liandry, Riftmaker, and tank items. This is really, really good if you don't have a front line. So Azir really benefits from having someone to DPS behind, but you can kind of take matters into your own hands and get a bit tankier yourself, and then it's not so bad. There are also some people, I think I can find an example here. I think Chovy played it somewhere. People playing Azir just with lethal tempo and the normal build. So then one thing that does is it allows you to kind of skirmish a little bit earlier, because you can get your attack speed a lot quicker. So you can do this. At the same time, there are still other people that are just playing the regular Conqueror Azir build, which is greedier. I think there's someone, yeah, this one here as well. I'm not sure. I think most people are still using Conqueror, but there's definitely options, right? So you can go lethal tempo if you want to spike a little earlier, go Conqueror for more scaling. Of course, you can still play the grass builds and stuff. Let's see. Oh, that's rapid fire. Is Showmaker played any others? Yeah, so there are some Azir games, but it's not being played a whole lot. I think it's more that like it gets picked in competitive because eventually you run out of options. I still wouldn't exactly recommend Azir to you guys. Like I said, it's just a hard champion to play, and I don't really think it's worth it. But I mean, if you're really, really good at it, I think potentially you could see it being, you know, even higher in A tier, particularly because it's like one of those champs that can pressure lane and it can, again, avoid ganks. Like, you sometimes do see Azir picked into Aurora, kind of for that reason that I was saying before, that like you need something that can simultaneously like pressure the lane while also being able to avoid ganks. Azir's not bad at this. He does lose to Aurora in the first few levels, but he does end up outscaling her, kind of like level 5, level 7, like that sort of timing, and is quite difficult to gank, which is kind of nice. I also want to elaborate a little bit on Ambessa, because a lot of people like question the placement. So Ambessa is a flex pick. She also scales really, really well, and she's a great counter to basically any melee. And if you look at some of the Korean RPGs, for example, if I open up BDDs here, yeah, if you can get away with Ambessa, basically it's great into the harder pressuring mage matchups. You definitely don't want to play it, but against something like LeBlanc, for example, that really just doesn't have the ability to get through someone that's playing D-Shield Second Wind in the early game, I think it can be really nice. And again, if you get away with it, the scaling is insane. So I do think Ambessa is underrated, and honestly, it's a champ I want to put some time into, because I think it's quite useful to, again, have an AD mid that beats other AD mids, as opposed to playing something a little more off-meta, like a Renekton or something like that. So yeah, I think it's very good. It has been played a little bit in competitive as well. Lastly, I just want to kind of talk about how the counter picks and blinds work in the meta. I will say that for most of you, you should just pick comfort. I think that prioritizing comfort is way better than knowing how to play every champ in the meta. That being said, I will make a guide on counter picking, specifically, you know, what every champ is weak against and what you can think about picking, but let's kind of go through the meta. So at the moment, the meta blinds are pretty much just picking OP champs. So things like Aurora, Galio, and Mel, I think all can be very good blinds. If you're not wanting to blind one of these, you probably want to blind something with a fair amount of mobility or the ability to play into lots of different matchups. So things like Ori, or even Viktor for his matchup strength can all be fine. Now, all of those are AP. If you want an AD blind, I do think AD blinds are weaker, but Yone is a pretty good AD blind. Jayce, because he's a flex pick and has a tank build, is not bad. You can also go for something like Corki. I think Corki has the ability to at least neutralize most lanes just because he is so strong early. But you do have to be a bit careful, because I think if you're not at least getting a small lead with Corki, it's not like you get outscaled, but you can end up being kind of useless because of your short range, right? Like if you snowball, it's much easier to hit people because you've got a lot of stats and levels to back that up. But yeah, if you fall behind, it can be difficult to actually get in range of people. So AD blinds, those are the ones you can consider. So how do we actually counter these S tier champions that are being picked? So Aurora, you can play for something that really blasts her 1v1. So we've got things like the Viktor or the Ori. You just got to be really careful if they do have strong gankers to really play around the windows, especially if you lose your flash. Things like Syndra can also be decent as well. If you want a mixture of mobility plus the ability to do decent in lane, there's things like Azir you can think of, or Vlad. Potentially, we could even go for something like an Ahri. You know, it's kind of a mix. I don't think it's like the best champion into Ambessa, but it's okay. Alternatively, you can just pick another S tier champion, right? Like that always works. Galio, so you can play normal mages into Galio, but I think if you have the option to, you should play some AD champ. Like I said, if you're going to play a mage, you probably want something that just scales. It's kind of difficult to push Galio out of lane, even with the strong lane bullies like Viktor or Ori, but you do outscale really, really hard, and if you have wave clear, you can pressure him quite a lot. So the AD champ specifically that you're looking for, I think Smolder, if you can play it, is basically a free win into Galio. It feels really, really good. Alternatively, you can look for something like Tristana. It's another greedy pick. Corki obviously is solid. And you can still play these other ADs like Ambessa, you know, Jayce, Yone, or whatever. Like, these are all fine. But I think, you know, if someone blind picks Galio, like, locking in a Smolder is absolutely insane. So I like looking for that. Mel, I mean, current state is just really, really overtuned, but I think the champs that will beat her are things with, again, low cooldowns and not super reliant on combos. So you can think of, like, Ori Q spam, Viktor E spam, as opposed to, like, you know, something like you know, Stylus that has to like E2 onto her, and she can just like, you know, even once you get on her, she can just like immune all the damage. I think is really, really rough. You know, anything that has to combo, basically, she just shields all the damage. So you probably want to play, like, range, low cooldowns, and not something that you're scared of. I think it's actually way less about the spell being reflected and way more about her just, like, immuning the damage. I think that's genuinely way more OP. So, yeah, let's go for Ori, let's go for Viktor, maybe even a Syndra, but be careful of, like, the QE, maybe. Although I'm not actually sure how that works. I guess it does reflect the QE stun. Haven't tried that, have to check. But yeah, those are kind of those out of the way. After that, when you come down to A tier, I mean, there's a whole bunch of champions that can be counterpicked or blinded. So, like, for example, you can blind Viktor. He's mostly fine into most matchups. You can definitely blind Yon. Silas, more of a counterpick champion. You can blind, but I'd really recommend countering. And if someone does blind Silas, you can look for, like, Zoe. You can look for a Cassio. You can look for LeBlanc. There's a few matchups that definitely terrorize him. Things like Ahri and Ori can be blinded. Mainly, the reason they're not picked more often is just because they're not actually as strong. Like, I think Aurora is a better version of Ahri, but if Aurora is taken away, and if Galio is taken away as well, then Ahri is still, like, one of the better, and maybe even the best, like, champ for playing the mid-jungle 2v2. So definitely Ahri is worth considering. Ori, I think, yeah, you can pick it with, like, hyper carries on your team, whether that's 80 carries or junglers. I think it's all around just, like, a decent pick. Akali, I think definitely a counter only. There's some matchups, like, these ones can be kind of hard, like the Galio is pretty annoying. There's not much you can do into Aurora, I think, other than just, like, kind of AFK neutralize. You can do that, by the way. Like, you can go D-shield second win champs and try to, like, sustain through, like, Victors and stuff. But at the same time, like, if you get your counter pick, you'd kind of want to do it a little bit more. Akshan, I think just a general greedy AD pick. Better as a counter, but I think you can blind. It's just there's a few matchups like Viktor and Syndra and stuff that can be pretty rough. Corki, another solid AD blind, can be picked basically whenever, to be honest. Like, you don't really want to play him against super long range. Like, I wouldn't pick him into Syndra or into Hui or something. But again, like, even in those matchups, you can just kind of chill and it's fine. He's pretty decent against, like, any of these. You know, Galio is okay against Aurora, although you can't pressure that hard because if you try and go onto her, she can just eat away. So I wouldn't, like, specifically pick Corki and Aurora, but it's fine. It's definitely playable. Zoe, a greedier pick. Really, really good if you can get away with it. I think going Zoe, I mean, we saw Zoe into Galio in the LCK, which I think is just like, you know, Galio's not going to pressure lane a whole lot. And even though you can't kill him, like Zoe, I think the main reason Zoe isn't played more in competitive is that her laning phase into some of these other mages, like Ori or Viktor, is pretty rough. But if you don't end up, you know, really getting punished in lane, and actually if you can get a lead in lane, it's really, really solid. Hui, more of a counter pick, I think specifically is good against either 80 carries mid or things that need to dash onto you, or just short range in general. Would not play Hui into really any mage. Maybe weaker laning mages can be fine, but I think ideally just shorter range or 80 carry mids is great. Talia, yeah, really greedy counter pick basically. If you can get away with Talia, it's insane, but blind picking Talia is absolutely atrocious. There's just so many mages like Viktor, like, you know, Aurora, Ori, Syndra that'll just pressure the lane super hard, so I wouldn't recommend that. Jayce, another okay AD blind. Ideally, though, you pick it with tank Jayce into some sort of AD mid, or maybe a burst mid. LeBlanc, you got to be careful with this. LeBlanc is not as good as before because people have gotten pretty tanky, but she's still like a good counter to certain champs such as Silas and Yon. Also, if you have like a ganking jungle and support, she gains a lot of value. Zed is like an okay AD blind in general. I think the best build is to play First Strike Eclipse Rush and just try and kind of neutralize until you get Eclipse, basically. And then once you get Eclipse, you can trade heavy. Ambessa, yeah, counter to melees. Lissandra, just counter to specific champs up here. It's kind of good against LeBlanc. It's kind of good against Ahri. Kind of good against Kali. So yeah, more of a counter pick. Nico, I think potentially could be played more. I think genuinely one of the biggest reasons you don't see more Nico is because of Aurora, right? Like, why play a champ that is strong in lane and doesn't scale when you can play one that does? But Nico is still okay if you're like, you know, a Nico one trick or whatever. And then yeah, Smolder, extremely greedy, playing the Galio or like blinded AD mids, or sorry, blinded melee mids. So you can think of things like it's really good against like Kiana or anything that can't pressure the lane really. It's like kind of good into Talon, like with your bone plating. You can easily play it into the weaker mages like TF, you know, Rise, Mouse, anything that's not going to just destroy you in lane. And then yeah, Azir, another decent all-round pick, okay into Aurora. Yeah, it's fine in some of these other picks as well. So yeah, that's kind of like just the general overview of counter picks and blinds. I just wanted to do that because I haven't made a counter pick or blind pick tier list to split. So that'll be it for this video. If you guys have any other questions, leave them in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.